Everyone to today's LAI webinar. My name is Kathy King. I'm International Vice President of Lambda Alpha International and a member of the Los Angeles chapter. And on behalf of the International Board and President Sheila Harris, I am thrilled to see everyone here. We have had a really tremendous response to our global webinars, which we kicked off during the pandemic, and the opportunity to all meet virtually. And it's really been a tremendous success. And we hope to continue, in some way having our global webinars well into the future. Today we have over 130 registrants, and we're going to be covering the second part of what so far is a three-part series, which we've entitled The Color of Law, based on the book by Richard Rothstein. And it's really in sync with where our organization is as we celebrate our 90th anniversary. We're taking a look at the intersection of land economics and equal justice. Part one of our Color of Law series was held in January, and you can actually see a recorded version of that webinar on our YouTube channel. So I invite you to look at that. And LaDale Winling, a historian and urban planner, really dug deep into some government policies over time and actions that led to segregation. Today, in our part three, we're going to be or part two, excuse me, we're going to be looking at the decisions over time of how public housing was located. So I invite you to also, after today's program, we'll have a recorded version available on our YouTube channel as well, along with the part one that I was mentioning earlier. And just want to say thank you to the inspiration that we received for the Color of Law series from our Minnesota chapter, and the wonderful book group that they started at the beginning of the pandemic that led us to, with the Twin Cities chapter, to take a look at this topic. So without further ado, I will be inviting Sheila Hamilton to show us our 90 Faces video, which is part of our 90th anniversary celebration. And when we come back, I'll introduce the moderator for today's program. Thank you, Sheila. And I hope that you enjoyed our 90 Faces for our 90 years. And you shared this video with all of our chapters. And so those of you who are LAI members, you should be seeing this video as part of your local programming as well. So thank you. All right, and now it's time to begin our program. I'm thrilled to introduce Joe Nathanson, who will be moderating our program today. Joe Nathanson is a retired principal of Urban Information Associates, which was organized to provide economic development and economic demographic consulting services. He was a resident of Philadelphia's public housing in his early years and holds a master's degree in city and regional planning from the University of Pennsylvania. He earned his undergraduate degree in architecture from MIT and has been a member of Lambda Alpha International since 1992, and currently a member of the Baltimore chapter, and served as president for 3 years of the Baltimore chapter. In recent years, Mr. Nathanson led consulting assignments relating to commercial revitalization, economic impact studies, and workforce housing. Several of those studies involve meeting with and documenting the experiences of immigrant and refugee communities in Atlanta, Buffalo, and several places in Maryland. In 2003, he served as an expert witness in the landmark case Thompson versus HUD, dealing with racially segregated public housing in Baltimore. As director of Metro Research for the Baltimore Metropolitan Council from 1992 to 2002, Mr. Nathanson had overall management responsibility for the Metropolitan Planning Agency's program of socioeconomic research. So I'll turn the mic over to Joe, who will introduce all of our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Kathy. So early in The Color of Law, the author Rothstein writes about the federal government mobilizing for World War II and the financing of housing for workers in defense industries. In the process, the government was creating racially segregated communities. I realized he was writing about me and my family's experience. My father had taken a job at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. And yes, starting at age 3, I was living in Philadelphia's all-white Bartram Village public housing project, my home for nearly a decade. Decades later, I was serving as an expert witness, as mentioned in the Thompson v. HUD case in federal court, and dealing with racial discrimination in Baltimore's public housing program. In the deposition prior to the trial, I was asked to cite factors for choosing public housing sites. I replied, well, as a former resident of public housing, I would consider the location of schools. Oh, at that point, the young Department of Justice attorney representing HUD stopped cold. For a moment, she didn't know how to proceed. I did not fit her image of a public housing resident. So with that, I would like to introduce our panel, 2 people who know so much about public housing and its history. I'd like to introduce E. Bradford Hunt, who's a professor and chair of the History Department of Loyola University, Chicago. His history of the Chicago Housing Authority, entitled Blueprint for Disaster, Unraveling of Chicago Public Housing, tells the story of the rise and fall of the city's public housing developments, with an emphasis on the planning and policy choices that undermined the program. The book was the Lewis Mumford Prize for from the American Society of City and Regional Planning History. Dr. Hunt received a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BA from Williams College. He's a member of Lambda Alpha's elite chapter. And our second panelist is Angela Brooks, AICP, and she's the Illinois Director for the Corporation for Supportive Housing, CSH. Angela recently joined CSH after serving as the development manager for the Chicago Housing Authority, where she was the primary liaison between the authority and the many stakeholders connected with public housing developments. Through her impressive career, she has developed a wealth of expertise in housing development, policy, and implementation across private, public, and nonprofit sectors. She's also known for her passion for access to housing and community development. Angela has a Master of Urban and Regional Planning from the University of New Orleans and a Bachelor of Arts in Urban Studies with a concentration in housing and community development from Jackson State University. She, as noted, is a certified planner with AICP and serves as a national board member of the American Planning Association, and is the past Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Chair. She is the current Vice President for Membership of the Ely chapter of Lambda Alpha. And with that, I'd like Brad to start. I think he has something to share on the screen.
Thank you, Joe. And I also want to thank Sheila Harris, Sheila Hamilton, Kathy King, and particularly Christine Williams and John DeVries for their work in organizing this whole series as we reflect on race and built environment in the 20th and 21st centuries. This is just such an important topic as we try to chart the history and the present of institutionalized racism. Sheila, Angela's the star today, so I'm going to take the story with a little bit of history, and I'm going to show you a few slides as a historian and get us to reflect a little bit on the past of public housing in Chicago, the past, and getting us up a bit to the present. Angela worked at CHA and is also doing tremendous work at the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And I think you're all going to want to really going to want to hear what she has to say. But let me walk you through a few slides and tell you where I'm coming from here. I've been working on this topic for a long time of public housing in Chicago. I've worked on an oral history, the book that Joe mentioned, and a book with my colleague, John DeVries, where we also thought about more recent work on the plan for transformation for Chicago. But public housing fundamentally really starts in the New Deal, as Richard Rothstein shows, discusses. And it's a progressive effort. I think we have to be careful not to lose sight of the vision that good housing was going to make better people. And that's why the federal government undertook this effort. However, it's going to get hijacked, if you will, by the racialization of urban policy in the second half of the 20th century, and really become strongly connected to urban African-American culture in very unfortunate ways. So let's talk about one development. This is one that Angela knows, the Harold Ickes homes. Of course, Harold Ickes was the first, was the Secretary of the Interior under President Roosevelt during the New Deal. And I've got this key moment in Life magazine in 1954. There's this story told in Life magazine, and only the way Life magazine can do it at that time, a photo essay about the Garrett family living in Chicago's slums on the South Side, the Garrett family living in a basement apartment with inadequate housing. This is just a horrendous scene. And the photo essay walks you through their transformation, their transition to the Harold Ickes homes. Now, the Ickes homes at the time was not finished. It looks a little unfinished on the sides, yes, but they're going to walk in and see this brand new apartment. To our eye today, we see a lot of cinder block, but this was really transformational, was the thought. If we can get people out of bad housing into good housing, then their lives will transform. Now, we now think of that as a very simplistic approach to what are very complex set of social problems, particularly the structural racism that a family like the Garrett family would have faced. And this location of places like the Harold Ickes homes is also a central theme in the Richard Rothstein book and among historians as well, as we seek to understand how public housing contributed to segregation in cities like Chicago. For many of these developments, and this is an aerial from 1958 of the South Side looking kind of north-south. That's the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks there. On the left, and the Dan Ryan Expressway will eventually be built to the left of this red box. But that site was thought of as one of the worst slums of Chicago, so let's rebuild it. The historians now think of this as building a second ghetto of public housing on top of a first one. And here's the second one. That is going to put the Robert Taylor homes, 4,000 units of public housing in a very long, narrow space. It's actually going to stretch even further north towards downtown, this 4-mile wall. Those of you who were in Chicago up until, who grew up in Chicago, this was up from 1963 to around the mid-2000s. It was rather bleak on the ground. very monotonous. And this is part of the what historians are calling, again, the Second Ghetto School. The most important book here, Arnold Hirsch, Making the Second Ghetto, where he looks directly at how city officials took a public housing program and used it in part as a domestic containment policy for African Americans who were migrating from the South, who put white neighborhoods at risk in the minds of white politicians. And so the idea was, well, we'll build new housing and this will accommodate Black families and keep them out of white neighborhoods. As Hirsch shows, it's not just public housing, it's things like violence, and there's a whole chapter on a stream of violence, just as Richard Rothstein shows. But the fundamental issue here is that public housing becomes a containment vessel for what is concentrated poverty. These are photos from the Sun-Times and the Tribune from the 1970s that were really, and the second one's from the early 80s, that are meant to racialize public housing and to really create this idea of its failure. There's a lot of resistance from the residents. I don't want anybody to think that residents took this lightly or lying down. They were fighting against a system stacked against them in many respects. And 2 decades of organizing was not able to transform, was not able to change the dynamics of maintenance, concentrated poverty, violence that is going to lead to the demise of these developments. So around the 2000s, the plan is hashed Plan for Transformation. I like this image because it shows you a former high-rise behind and the new urbanist model in front. And this is going to be a sea change in the way public housing is conceived in Chicago. Henry Cisneros comes to Chicago in 1996 as HUD secretary. Even Bill Clinton pays a visit, and they say this stuff just has to come down. But it's a messy transformation. There's a dynamic here between HUD, Mayor Richard M. Daley below, the CHA, and Alex Polikoff at the top, who was the lawyer who in 1966 filed a lawsuit saying that the Housing Authority was discriminating in its site selection, discriminating in how it allocated units, and that the solution was to break up these developments and to move as many residents as possible into neighborhoods that he called opportunity zones. He wanted to, in essence, move residents out into white communities and saw integration as the most important solution to the problem. But the problem of tearing down and moving people was also messy. And where did people end up going? They didn't go into white neighborhoods. This lost opportunity as public housing came down. We did not take advantage of that to use government resources to promote racial integration. Instead, we moved people into West Side, South Side neighborhoods, which did not help Chicago's deep racial divides. The Plan for Transformation is certainly somewhat controversial. This is on the South Side, Oakwood Shores. I like showing this is a billboard from around 2009, I believe. It was right as the market was cratering. But you see who the market is. This is a Black community, and the billboard shows a lovely white couple eating pizza boxes and a lovely Asian American family with their child. To the Black residents of this community, it did not appear that the new communities being developed, the new mixed income communities, would be for them. Now, that's a complicated story. I look forward to talking more about it. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Angela. And that was a whirlwind tour through CHA history. I'm sure we can continue the conversation in a moment.
Absolutely. I actually had never seen that that billboard, so I had a visceral effect to that too, because I live in that general area. I guess since you kind of went over some of the stuff I worked on, I'll just kind of do an update just to kind of bring people to where we are. We started out with Harold Ickes, which, to give you context, and thank you for that aerial, Brad, it really kind of shows you how the public housing units really took over what would be called the Bronzeville neighborhood in Chicago. Harold Ickes was 18 acres. It was 1,000 units. In the fall of 2014, CHA released RFP selecting a developer. The developer was selected in June of 2015, and phase 1 units are scheduled to be delivered later this year. But I just say that time frame so you can kind of see the length of the process to return the units to these communities. The Southbridge site are now called Harold. A part of the plan for transformation is also rebranding the sites, with the exception of a few that have historic value, i.e. Lathrop, because I know Related is on this call, that was maintained, but the vast majority of them, the names were changed. So Harold Hicks is now called Southbridge. It will be 877 residential units. 770 will be rental, 107 will be home ownership, and it'll be multiple phases. This site is a TOD. It's right by the CTA red and green lines and in the South Loop. So for those of you who've been to Chicago for a conference, it's walking distance to both Chinatown, but also the convention center. The other site Brad also talked about was Ida B. Wells, Madden Homes, and Darrow, which have now become Oakwood Shores, which is the slide before. This site was humongous. It was 94 acres. It was a total of almost 3,300 units. And you can kind of see the original site. This was a lower scale compared to some of the high rises, but still a lot of density in the Bronzeville community, which is just south of the convention center, for those of you who've been here and adjacent to the lakefront. So this is an aerial of kind of that space and what will come here. So this is one of the Hope 6 sites that we got a grant for. Not we, I no longer work there. CHA received a grant for in 2000. And to date, they've brought about 800 units back to that site. It's very, very, very suburban looking, if you will, compared to what was there before. But most importantly, well, not most, but for somebody who lives in the neighborhood, most importantly, a pivotal change for CHA on this site. You know, at some point there was a realization that you can't just build housing. People need to be able to work somewhere. They need to be able to walk and do services. So it was very controversial at the time, but 10 acres of this site, the southwest side of the site was sold and became a supermarket, a Bronzeville Mariano's. And a really great thing about that store is initial hires, they hired over 150 CHA residents to work at the store. There's still a lot of mixed emotions about that decision. It continues at Cabrini Green, which most of you also heard of. There is a target that was placed on former CHA land there. So just depending on how you take it, on where you might fall on thoughts on that one. So this is Altgeld Murray Homes. This is the largest public housing site left within the CHA portfolio. It was originally over 2,000 units. It's now down to a little over 1,500. It's on the very far south side of Chicago. Not being a native, the first time I went there, I was trying to figure out why they were taking me to the suburbs, because it is that far south. It is closer to Indiana than it is to downtown Chicago. So this aerial view gives you a real scheme of what's there. And I will have to, I hate to admit this, but I had been working in the Altgeld site for about 4 years before. You can see the Calumet River on the back, the south portion of that site. It took me 4 years to even know it was there, because there was absolutely no connectivity to the river. In 2013, CHA did a master plan for Altgeld. The chart on your left kind of shows you there's been significant investment in the renovation of Altgeld. As of that date, about $320-ish million for construction of laundry facilities, as well as the rehab of the sites, but also demolition of approximately 500 units, because there is an operational desire not to have that many units in a relatively isolated site. You can see on this master plan site, the upper right corner, you'll see future Red Line station. When I left the CHA, the CTA was Chicago Transit Authority, was in the process of amending their EIS to potentially put the end of the Red Line at 130th to go across to the green portion on the right side of the Altgeld site. So it would go within the footprint of the Altgeld Garden site. That will be absolutely transformational. I one time actually did take public transit out there. It took me about 2 hours. It's 45 minutes on the Red Line from downtown to the 95th station, but it's a good hour on the bus that goes from 95th to 130th. And those of you not in Chicago's a grid system, so 95th to 130th isn't that far, but it's not an express bus. And I took a tour of the entire far south side. And I also learned that there are a lot of Uber drivers who work in Alt Guild, because I took an Uber back to work. And the last slide I'll show at Alt Guild is just kind of the things. The master plan identified that this is an isolated community. We had to provide more amenities within that community because getting anywhere is very, very difficult. I don't know that I'll ever be more proud of any other project in my career. This is the Alt Guild Family Resource Center. It is a $25 million community facility that will be a daycare. There are approximately 3,700 residents of Alt Guild, of which 50% are under the age of 21 and probably 40% under the age of 18. So daycare needs are strong. There were 2 daycares, but at very, very, I'll say pretty deplorable daycare facilities. So this is a new 21,000 square foot daycare that provides the capacity to double infant rooms, as well as a Chicago Public Library and additional community space. As you can imagine, if you have almost 4,000 people living in a small community, there's need for community space for programming, of which there was not very much. So this facility, there was Mayor Lori Lightfoot just had the official kind of grand opening 2 weeks ago. So the Alt Guild Family Resource Center, I'm sure all of you will see, no matter where you are, going up for awards for architectural design and things of that nature. It really will be a transformative project. And I will stop my sharing now. And Brad and I can just have a conversation.
Yes, terrific. So I wanted to ask you right off the bat, you know, that Alt Guild project is stunning. And Alt Guild is where Barack Obama got his start as a community organizer, and he struggled in the early 80s there. What did you learn from the process, from the experiences with residents as you went through that process down at Alt Guild?
There's a lot I learned at Alt Guild. The first thing being, I am not from Chicago. I'm from Seattle, and Seattle just didn't do public housing in the same way. And when I left Seattle, Seattle wasn't as dense as it is now. So Seattle was still kind of a sleepy city. So just that whole density was a hard kind of transition for me. Going to planning school did not prepare me for that at all. So the first thing I just learned is resiliency. But I also got a new perspective on public housing residents to the extent that I think often as a Black planner, people assume I automatically identify with people, and that's not the case at all. So it really was a good transition for me because I started at Alt Guild even before I was on the real estate side of CHA. So I really got to learn about residents organizing. Some of the environmental justice movement started at Alt Guild. Hazel Johnson is kind of the mother of environmental justice, and she was an Alt Guild resident. So that history of organization was there, but also the kind of idea that, and it kind of ties into the Gautreaux lawsuit, that people want to live in the communities they want to live in. You know, there's not you can't just assume that if given the opportunity, people want to live somewhere else. People want equal access to amenities. They don't want to necessarily move. And when I think about that, I use myself as an example. For those of you in Chicago, I live in the Washington Park neighborhood of Chicago, which is the south side. It's west of the University of Chicago, but I'm a gentrifier, just happen to be the same race. I make 3 times the census tract average income of my census tract. So I obviously could live anywhere in Chicago, but I choose to live here. So if you think about somebody with a graduate degree not from here making that choice, somebody who grew up in these neighborhoods, you're now saying, oh, I'm going to give you the opportunity to live in a neighborhood where nobody looks like you. And I mean, you know, it's an example of when sometimes do good policy and theory kind of doesn't think about the cultural and the social implications of decisions.
But one more thing about Alt Guild I think is really interesting. You mentioned the environmental justice movement. That's because there's a giant wastewater treatment plant next door, as well as ComEd buried a whole lot of transformers at one point. And that site is near a lot of other industrial sites. And somehow the water there is just awful. And the public housing residents are the ones who were saying, hey, we're getting cancer at a high rate. It was like, and Hazel Johnson resident was one of them. And the remarkable stories of people like her who, who in another world would have been running some sort of major corporation. I mean, these are really dynamic, capable people able to influence change. I would say one more thing about Alkeld is that it's built during the war years and it's way out, as you mentioned, and it was racially integrated from the start and pretty quickly transitions to largely African-American residents, and the white suburban residents nearby did not like that at all. And when the CHA later in the late 1940s, early 1950s said, we'd like to build more things like Alkeld Gardens in a semi-suburban setting, maybe not that far out, but on vacant land, not far from white communities, the city council alderman said, no way. You're going to build slum clearance projects and rebuild black slums in an effort to keep black people there. So Alkeld is this really interesting outlier. Anyway, sorry.
It is. And, you know, one of the things I have to say to you that I read your book in the last 2 months, but I wish I had read it at the beginning of my time at CHA, because it really does, from somebody who did a lot of work with residents, and, you know, there's a lot of pushback for the plan for transformation, you know, kind of the historical knowledge of the policies. Your book did a really good job of really pointing that out and including both thought processes. And I mean, it's stuff I assumed, but I never knew. So I think it's a pretty important history to know for the policymakers, because the racial segregation in Chicago is startling. I'm obviously not from a diverse area. Seattle's not that diverse, but to the extent that it is, I mean, you can literally tell the dividing lines in Chicago. If I meet somebody by race and even by ethnicity, I can almost guess what neighborhood they're from, which is not necessarily the case in other cities in the same way.
Yeah, that's
while the dialogue between Brad and Angela continues, I'd like to invite our participants of the webinar to pose their questions in the chat, and I'll be looking for that.
Terrific. Yeah.
Well, maybe I could ask a very basic question.
Absolutely.
With the transformation, the overall vision, will there be more or fewer public housing units available?
Now, see that now you're starting stuff, Joe. So that is also
I've been known to do that. Yes.
That is part of the controversy. I have half a mind to make you bring Will Tippins out of the attendees into the panel so he can take some of this smoke on that question too. So essentially, it's not always the case, but in a lot of the plan for transformation sites, the general number return was 1/3 public housing, 1/3 affordable, 1/3 market rate. In some of the more recent developments of CHA, for instance, Harold Ickes, it's actually 50% market rate. So it'll be 33% public housing, whatever the difference between 33 and 50 is for affordable, and then 50% market rate. A lot of pushback on that, because you're going from 1,000 public housing units to essentially 244 at Harold Ickes. So it is not necessarily a 1-for-1.
Okay.
It's not 1-for-1 at all. The total number of vouchers and affordable housing opportunities has kept pace. No, kept pace is the wrong word. If you add up all the rebuilt public housing, and some of it has been just renovated as public housing, like Wentworth Gardens near White Sox Park, and you take the public housing units within the mixed income communities, like the new Ickes Southgate project, and you take all the vouchers, the number has been pretty flat, I believe, and over the last few years, and may have actually gone up. I don't know about the last 4 or 5 years, but that there's been this radical shift from hard units of public housing owned by the Chicago Housing Authority to the Chicago Housing Authority farming out vouchers to low-income residents. And so it hasn't been a huge, massive loss of total affordable housing opportunities.
Right.
But the question is a voucher as stable and as going to last? You know, will that be away, funding cut or something?
Yeah, and I think part of the important note is that in the new plan for transformation, communities are now plan forward, or whatever cool name CHA comes up with. CHA does not own the units, it's third-party developers and their property management. So it's a different model altogether. And it's just kind of a shift in policy, to Brad's point, between if the hard unit is better or vouchers that can go in the community, and then the sustainability of those vouchers, because at any given moment, those numbers could change, because that's a federal budget decision every year. So
Can I ask you, Angela, about your thoughts on the mixed income model, as now that you're out of CHA, and maybe you've had some time to think about this. And is this a good model? We're 20 years into it, and have we reflected on it?
I think, again, this is a bunch of policy people sitting around playing with decisions of things that in theory make really good sense. But if you think about it, in very many communities that are market rate, do people interact with their neighbors? And I don't actually. I was asked this about a year ago, so I made it a point to meet my neighbors below me. But I live in a market rate building, and I don't know my neighbors. So in theory, yeah, I think it could potentially work. I think at the big end, at the end of the day, I think the thing that makes communities successful is access to, well, safety. Because like I tell people all the time, I'm not walking around my neighborhood very much. So safety, being able to go grocery shopping, be able to actually sit down and eat, and actually having access, like the store at the end of my block. I think I probably pay $3 more for a gallon of milk than at a real grocery store, but there's no grocery store until recently near me. So, those are the types of things that make healthy communities. It doesn't matter if somebody next door to me makes more or less. In theory, I absolutely think mixed income communities make the most sense. But in practice, I just don't know that anybody interacts with their neighbors in the way that maybe my parents did when I was a child. So I don't know that it really makes that much of a difference. But absolutely, if it means that poor people have access to infrastructure and their street gets cleaned up, or they have a park that gets mowed, sure. But, all of the other things are just correcting poor policy and lack of, investment in communities.
I frame this a little bit in my book as it's easy to build housing, it's hard to build community. And in the post-war period, planners, progressives thought, we can build a lot of units, and it's a unit problem. How much housing can we build? And the difficulty of building community was not a problem that was addressed to the same extent. And so large projects with thousands of units housed a lot of people, but didn't give the space for the community.
And I
Brad,
think
your book raises a question from one of our attendees. Christine Williams says, Brad's book talks about the ratio of adults to children. How does Altgeld address that issue?
Altgeld probably does not do a good job of addressing that in just pure percentages. But what I will say overall, there aren't a whole lot of large units being currently built by CHA. So that in itself will address it. You'd be hard pressed to find very many 4 bedrooms in the new portfolio. Altgeld's probably one of the few, maybe Dearborn and maybe Wentworth might still have a few, but generally the newer units aren't going to have that many bedrooms. And so if you have 2 heartbeats to a room, that really does limit the ability for those numbers to be totally out of alignment. But Altgeld certainly is definitely on the pushing of that. But even within that, it's only so large because you can only have 2 heartbeats per room. So
you said about half the Altgeld is youth or under 21. And that is significantly better, significantly lower than like the Robert Taylor homes, it was more like 60 and 70.
That is true.
Yeah. And that, I argue, is one of the challenges for managers. You got a lot of teenagers running around, and it's rough.
And it's also part of the reason, though, within Altgeld, after the renovation of the units, that the focus is on non-residential amenities, because there are so many, understanding there has to be, the family works provider needs to be able to have space to program and provide programming and activities for children. There is a huge park. They have an amazing pool at Altgeld. They actually really do have, they have just started a bike club in that community. Altgeld is adjacent to the Riverdale neighborhood, which is not to be confused with the Riverdale city. And so in the Riverdale community, it's connected with the Major Taylor bike trail. So they've done a really good job of, they have divvy bike stations now. So they're doing a really good job of kind of thinking through how do we increase connectivity and activities.
Well, on connectivity, can I get this question in? You pointed out a plus for Alfred was the location of a rail transit stop at the
In
edge
the
of
future, it's
in the-
it's in the EIS stage. So
Okay,
that thing's
but-
probably not coming.
But is that a consideration for the other sites as part of the transformation, either rail or significant access by bus?
As I'm thinking about the plan for transformation sites specifically, most of them are pretty well accessed. A lot of the CHA sites that are not within the plan for transformation, most have bus. Altgate was just the outlier because it's so far outside of the real footprint of the city, but the majority of them, Chicago, if nothing else, Chicago does really well with transit, even if it's bus. Train, but most of the communities are relatively accessible via bus.
Can I turn, Angela, briefly to your current work where you're helping run the Corporation for Supportive Housing? Tell us, you had, in our previous conversations, you'd mentioned your work on prison reentry work, and that is such critical work. And I just wanted our audience to hear just a little bit about that before we go to some more questions from them.
Yeah, so the Corporation for Supportive Housing is really, a lot of the work that we do is going to be around homeless housing, but we aren't necessarily thinking about transitional. We think about permanent supportive housing. So the permanent piece is what we really think a lot about. We are a CDFI, so we get allocations of new market tax credits. So we are about creating new permanent supportive housing units. We recently received grant funding from the MacArthur Foundation to work with the Illinois Department of Corrections. One of the biggest issues for, well, not biggest, a pretty large issue for people formerly incarcerated is housing for a variety of reasons. But essentially, they probably need about 500 more units than they have access to house, even transitionally, people leaving the prison system. And so our grant work would do looking at what their current processes are. They've got a lot of contracts with transitional housing where they pay for units for, I think, 90. During the pandemic, it probably went up to about 120 days while they look for permanent housing solutions. So we will kind of look at the system failures, kind of really they don't actually have a lot of good data on what that number is. So what's that missing number that they need to find units for? And how do we come up with a process? If you know someone's up for parole, maybe 2 years out, they might get parole. How do you start tracking that in the system so you could be prepared with a plan? And then ultimately developing an RFP for them to come up with transitional housing providers that can assist them in more permanent solutions, as well as case management to help identify that. Because as I'm sure you know in your work, if you have a record, it's really hard to find housing.
Yeah, that's such a critical problem in the communities. Yeah, we had a question from the audience. You want to read that, Joe? Sorry.
Do you see the question? Maybe you can address it.
I'll read it. There is CHA working with a 15-minute neighborhood context, meaning walking 15 minutes to rail transit, and then density may be up to 5 FSR, and 2+ bedroom units are rare. I'm not sure. In our community, I'm sorry, in our community within walking distance of rail transit, density may be up to 5 FSR, and 2+ bedroom units are rare. Do you allow inboard bedrooms in CHA, no exterior window from the bedroom? I don't think that's allowed.
No.
But I don't know about the planning context for mixed income communities, I guess, is part of the question, and walking distance.
Yeah, and I guess, and part of the control lawsuit really has to do with within CHA building on the existing footprint they have. That wasn't definitely, so CHA's plan for transformation is going on existing sites that they already had. So in theory, that would be a great context to have for like new development if they're buying new land, but for actual, the majority of the work that our team worked on was the stuff we had already developed, and your book talks about how that got chosen. So there was definitely no very thoughtful process for connectivity and access to walking to anything when those sites were determined. So
Just so the audience understands, I'm not sure we mentioned, did I mention Gautreaux? I mentioned Al Polikoff. Gautreaux
Oh,
is
yeah.
the term for the lawsuit filed in 1966 that governed all CHA development under a court order until recently, I believe. I don't remember the exact date when the
And
court.
it still hasn't ended.
It still hasn't ended, but it's slowly, 2018 is the, thank you, is the last year when the
Thank
court
you, Jeanette.
really controlled where things would go. You know, if the Polikoff and the Gautreaux lawyers didn't want something built, it wasn't going to happen, right? I mean, is my understanding.
There were negotiations.
There were negotiations, right? Thank you.
And that includes use of vouchers.
Yeah. So this Chicago's that does have this overlay of that legal process that makes the redevelopment different than, say, in other cities. I mean, there are cities across the country that have also done Hope 6 developments and not had the level of legal court battles that Chicago has had. And it's in part because our city really was, had that strong racialized component around site selection, and the courts found that we were discriminating at a level that other cities had not.
You have a good question in the chat,
Yeah.
Brad.
Yeah.
I'll read this one to you, so since it's
Okay.
all you. Going back to those early pics before Robert Taylor homes were built, the existing slum or ghetto was cleared. I assume white planners at the time determined it to be terrible and therefore should be cleared out. But what was their opposition? What was the real situation on the ground?
So, okay, I'm going to think I understand this question. White planners at the time were divided. There were progressives who said, well, look, this clearing the slums is going to take too long. It's too expensive. Let's go build more alt garden-like projects on the fringes of the city on vacant land. And then over time, the slum housing will just wear out and economically go away. Were they really slums? Yeah, these were awful housing conditions. I mean, this is a neighborhood that did not get hit by the Chicago fire in 1871. There was a lot of housing that was built haphazardly after the fire to accommodate people who were homeless in the early 1870s. I mean, these were places, there were still some outhouses in the 1940s in some of these buildings. Not all of them were slums, but when you had a model from the 1930s and 40s that said, what percentage of housing is slum housing, and it's high, then the idea is we got to wipe away the whole neighborhood. There was never a thought that, okay, maybe we rehab some of this, maybe we tear down a little and do a much more nuanced rebuilding. And in the process of clearing these slums, yes, some of them were awful housing that needed to come down, but some of them were solid buildings that could have been preserved. And that's a homeowner, often an African-American homeowner, who's renting out maybe the other unit, renting out a unit, and is making money that way. And it really devastates the small property owners of the neighborhoods that got cleared. The situation on the ground then was more complicated than planners thought. But in the 40s and 50s, the idea was all this has got to go. It just is a bulldozer solution. And just as we won the war by building more tanks and bombers than anybody else, we were going to win the war against the slums by wiping away many square miles and rebuilding. And just as the city had been cleared by fire and rebuilt, the cities just constantly were expected to be rebuilt. And that's the mindset of the 40s and 50s. And it's not till the 60s and 70s that people start to question this, like, wait a second, the bulldozer becomes way too harsh. Only in Black neighborhoods, yes. So there were some white slums that were cleared mostly for highways, but Richard J Daley, the mayor of Chicago from 55 to 76, realized pretty quickly, I don't want to clear more white slums. And he cleared one to build the University of Illinois in Chicago, and he got a lot of heat for that from white residents. And after that, no, public housing is going to go only in Black communities. Thank you.
That's actually kind of how I fell into planning, Brad. When you talk about the interstate system, my family's from Louisiana, and you hear it all throughout the South. Interstate 10 and Interstate 20 just really decimated Black communities, and so that's how I actually, hearing my grandmother talked about her house being taken from eminent domain and where they had to move, and just like the desecration of the Black community in both New Orleans and Monroe, Louisiana, where my family is from. It's like, oh, that's what I want to do. So that's actually how I got into planning.
Yeah, I mean, that highway story is a whole nother story. We could do a color of law 4. And I got a guy who knows a lot about highways in Chicago.
I had a consulting assignment a few years ago, took me to Miami, and I learned about Overtown and how that vibrant Black community was just destroyed by an interstate highway that was located there.
Yeah. Ooh, I'm gonna let you touch this last question.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that Liddell Windling talked a little bit about at our first session. Yeah, Homer Hoyt and Richard T. Ely. Richard T. Ely kind of invents the real estate economics, and he held views that today we would find, completely inappropriate and repugnant. Homer Hoyt was more of a data guy, math guy, but also, it's impossible to underestimate two things. One, how social scientists in the early 20th century took race, there was just a racist ideology that was embedded in all of academia, frankly. And this as part of the eugenics movement. There's a whole feeling that race was determinative. And the second thing is it's impossible to underestimate how important race was to homeowners in white neighborhoods in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And all the way up to today. This is the problem we face today. And we're maybe headed in the right direction, but race is still the number one thought, I think, in real estate context, and it's very discouraging.
Yeah, and I think in the very far south suburbs of Chicago, Olympia Fields and Flossmoor, Homewood, Tesca did a redlining study on commercial real estate. They are unable to attract, despite having very high median incomes, the type of commercial development neighbors like Orland Park receive. And it really clearly outlined the case that but for race, there's really no substantial difference in those areas. And that was done in the last probably 10 years. So it was just very startling for, to see the numbers, and just really, it's disheartening because you kind of want to give credit that there's more progress and there really isn't. And when you're looking at African-American communities of pretty decent incomes having the same struggles as maybe even my community, it's just like, wow, is it any better?
Christine just told me that our next program, Color of Law 3 in June, will deal with highway clearance. So good, thank you. I wasn't aware of that. There was a question about, we've been discouraging, and we've expressed our discouragement, Angela and I have in the last few minutes. And the question was, what would we recommend to change this conversation? Now this is the historian, I'm a historian. So I'm going to say, oh, people need to learn more about this history. Now, is that, I don't know, sometimes I say that and I think that's kind of Pollyannish, but I can tell you that when I talk to students at a place like Loyola, who are very smart, who've had, AP US history, they don't learn about the fact, they don't get a Richard Rothstein story about how embedded race is in our built environment and real estate practices in the past, and how that helps explain the segregated environment we have today. I think, I don't know, are we still ignorant about this would be my first question.
Yeah, and I think for me, I think it's really about and I can speak more as a planner, when I approach communities, I think a lot of policy decisions really taking community input seriously, and not just a checkbox like, oh, I had this token community meeting, if only 3 people shown up. I think you really have to take in consideration, particularly anybody that works in any part of the built environment, what is it that the community you're intending to serve want? And I think if you actually do that, all of these other things won't matter as much. And I think I have actually seen more people actually owning it. I mean, I'm really active in a lot of planning type organizations, and actually having planners go into communities and acknowledge your community looks like this because my predecessors did this. is start. But unless you own that, I'm not ever going to trust what you do. So I think there's a point to you, Brad, of people understanding the history and the impacts, but also owning, accepting it, and approaching it from a historical kind of background to address, hey, we didn't do this right. This is how we're going to move forward. But you have to acknowledge that, or you won't. If you're working in a built environment with communities, you'll never get the trust.
Yeah, I would love to see more active lending programs and grant programs to on that housing piece, because the home ownership piece, where the lending programs like the FHA and things that really help build a middle class wealth through home ownership. That a new program could be part of a way to change that balance around home ownership for African Americans. I don't know.
We had, for the Ely chapter a couple of months ago, we had Bruce Ornston in the Chicago Cook County assessor on, but Bruce produced a documentary, The Shame of Chicago, The Color Tax, and it really talked about, I mean, it really documented kind of the history and really bad FHA policies and contract sales and things like that. It was just, but yeah, I mean, disproportionately Black and brown people own homes. If they do own homes in neighborhoods that look like them, it's going to be worth less, even if it's a similar house. So, you know, it all trickles down. And I try to think about things that can be better. One of the things we do with CSH as a lender is we have a whole BIPOC initiative. So we're thinking about what funds can we work with minority developers that might be smaller, that are interested in getting into the affordable and supportive housing space, but there are obstacles, and we all know all of the obstacles to lending. So what products can we come up with, and how can we approach it to kind of meet that need to get them started? We mostly on that end do acquisition and pre-development loans, but honestly, for a smaller development, those are the funds they're going to have a hard time getting as well. So we really are looking at that. And I think most banks are right now looking at how do they address that kind of supporting that space. So,
Angela, we had a question. What's that Bruce Ornstein documentary's title? I can't remember either.
Shame of Chicago, and it's going to be a series, but the particular one that's kind of out and being shown now is The Color Tax.
Yeah. Okay.
We only have a couple more minutes. I'm wondering if either of you might have some words of encouragement or direction for HUD Secretary Fudge. Any thoughts on that score?
Go ahead, Angela.
I'll let you go first.
Okay, so I think it's very interesting that the Biden plan includes a whole lot of capital funding for public housing communities. And I think if that can stay in that bill, and if Secretary Fudge can push that, you know, make that happen, that will be a real boost to housing authorities like New York and others that did not tear down large quantities of their housing, but have huge deferred maintenance problems. It's that deferred maintenance. We built these things in the 50s. They're now 70 years old. And, you know, it's not just replacing the roof now. There's whole sorts of structural, you know, I mean, the LAI members know more about this than a historian, but you know, this is really finally some resources that have not been there the last 20 years.
I think I should turn the program back to Kathy King. We're in our last minute, and maybe Kathy, unmuting, will have some final thoughts for us. Kathy? I'm not sure. So in my role as moderator, then, I'm going to thank both Brad and Angela for the lively discussion and the response to the questions we got from our audience, and conclude with my gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. You're so great to talk to you.
Yes, thank you.